Hi everyone, it is Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a video lecture when I talk a little bit about the appointment in Sammara, because we're shifting gears and we're talking about a fable. An appointment in Sammara is a great fable to look at. And notice within these fables, we can start to look at themes or ideas that a fable might be dealing with. And fables generally tend to be really, really short stories. So you'll notice the appointment in Samara is very short. And yet it has some pretty powerful themes. Oftentimes, students will read the appointment in Samara and they'll be kind of confused at the end. So I thought it was important that I wanted to create a little lecture that might help out students to understand the fable itself. So I think when we look at the appointment of Samara, the first thing we have to look at is we want to ask ourselves, where is the fable set? And the fable is actually set in Iraq. And I always imagine if we are making sort of the appointment of Samara into a movie or a TV show, we might zoom over the country of Iraq. We zoom down into the city itself, and we come across a market in Baghdad. And notice if we are here sitting in this market, it's a busy market and there are hundreds of people buying all sorts of crazy stuff. And all of a sudden, we have a servant who's walking to this market and he turns the corner and there he comes across death. And notice the servant freaks out. He sees death, he freaks out, and he runs away and he goes all the way to the city of Samarra. And the next day, the master arrives and he's really mad. So he goes back into that same market and he's pushing people out of the way. And he turns a corner and he comes across Death and he gets in Death's face and he says, "Death, what are you doing? Why are you making fun of my servant?" And Death responds, "Well, I was actually not making fun of him. I was surprised to see him because I have an appointment with him later on today in Samara." And notice oftentimes when I ask students what is their reaction to the appointment at Samara, they say it's funny. And I always tell students, you have a really sick and twisted sense of humor because you think this fable is funny, yet that poor servant is going to die. And so then I think we can raise all sorts of interesting questions about the appointment in Samara, right? And one of the things that we can look at, there's a couple things we can look at. Notice that the narrator of the appointment in Samara is Death. And so notice we're hearing the story from Death's point of view. But there's also another trick to the fable because notice Death is a woman. And once we understand that, the fable can carry all sorts of different meanings. Because think about it, I think we generally have this view that Death, the traditional view of Death is that hooded figure that's carrying a scythe, right? That's bony. But notice by changing and making Death a woman, it completely changes the story overall. Because notice then we can ask questions like, well, maybe the man was afraid of women, right? Notice the fact that the story is set in Baghdad, in a country in the Middle East where women aren't always treated with respect. Sometimes women are treated as second-class citizens. Well, it's rather ironic that Death would be a woman, right? Because right, it would make sense because we always think we're all born from a woman. So why, when death comes, doesn't it would make sense that Death would be a woman? And notice it also opens up all sorts of ideas because you could look at it this fable from a feminist point of view. You could also look at it in LGBTQ uh, some theories as well. And notice if we were to look at some simple themes, right? Some very simple themes of the story, right? The story deals with issues of questions of fate and destiny, right? But I think we can dig a little bit deeper in the story because there's a lot more going on than just say fate and destiny. Because notice one of the stories could be deal with the relationship between a servant and a master, because notice the servant is afraid so much of Death that he runs away, but the master's not. The master gets in front, confronts Death. And so maybe a simple theme could be, don't be afraid of Death, right? Another theme idea chose kind of the relationship between a servant and a master, because a servant might be, so pummeled down that he's afraid of everything, whereas a master is afraid of absolutely nothing. So, I mean, there are some really interesting themes. One of the themes could be, right, maybe death has a sense of humor, because notice death is kind of bored. Think if you were death, you would basically going around, going to retirement homes, meeting with old people, and maybe death is really bored. So death is just kind of looking around this market and points at some random stranger and is like, oh my God, look at that person. That person ran away, right? So maybe it is that, death is bored, or death has a sense of humor. So there's all sorts of interesting things that we can look at outside of the traditional themes of fate and destiny. Now, sometimes students come up with the best ideas of what this fable could mean. So I one time had a student. Now this student had served in the military and been sent to Iraq during the War on Terror, and he thought actually that the story was a reference to the War on Terror. And I said, well, how did you come up with that idea? Well, he had served in Iraq. He was part of the initial invasion into Iraq, and he lost some friends uh, who had served in the war. But when the war initially started, the war was very easy, and it would, our military was able to quickly, take over and control Baghdad. And initially, people thought the war was going to be easy, that we had won. But if you go back and look at the history, right, in Sammara, there's this beautiful mosque, and the terrorists blew up this mosque in Sammara. And when they blew up that mosque, it was the first time that everyone realized, oh my gosh, that the war isn't going to be easy, that this is going to be a kind of a long, prolonged fight. So sometimes students come up with the most interesting ideas on what the fable might mean. So I just wanted to give you some ideas of what people thought of the appointment of Sammara. And as you kind of are answering some of the discussion board questions, or coming up with your paper for this, I want you to go big and deep in your themes. Don't just go with simple things like fate and destiny, but see if you can push yourself and have fun with kind of exploring this idea. And in the end, I kind of hope this video helped, and I just wanted to give you some ideas of what the fable's all about.